Welcome again to the MOOC on the EU in global governance. Today we're going to see how the EU fits into international relations in general. So we will look at how international relations theory can help us to understand how the EU fits into the international order. International relations theory will help us understand what kind of an actor the EU is on the global stage, if it is an actor at all, and what is its place in the international order. Furthermore, it will help us to assess the EU's performance as a global actor, and here it is very important to underline that the assessment of the EU or of any international actor depends quite substantially on one's views on the nature of the international system, as Karen Smith has quite rightly put it. And in this regard, theories of international relations provide us with an explanatory and conceptual framework which put together these views of international order into a coherent whole. These theories explain what drives international relations, who and what matters on the global stage, and why are things happening. There is a classical distinction of theories of three main currents in IR theory: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. There are also other approaches, feminist approaches, Marxist approaches to IR, which can provide interesting insights. For this introductory video, however, we will focus on the three classical ones. Let us have a look at these main theories of international relations and their main tenets, so their assumptions of what holds the international order together. For realist scholars, the international system is an anarchic self-help system, with states as its main actors and their main goal being maximization of power and security. It is a battle for survival. For liberal scholars, on the other hand, things are not quite so bleak. They do not like to see the state as a black box, but they want to look into it and establish the links between domestic politics and interest groups and the international scene. So what drives foreign policy from inside the state? Here, what is of particular importance to them are bargaining processes within the state between these groups and institutions and across different levels of governance. For constructivist scholars, lastly, it is ideas that matter, so they look beyond what they call positive factors, be it military or economic power. For them, the international order is constructed, and so it can be and reconstructed based on emerging new norms. For IR theory, the EU is a strange animal, which is not always quite easy to fit into these theoretical frameworks, especially realism. Why? Because the EU is not a state, so it is not one of your traditional international actors. But it is also unlike your usual international organization, so it's not just a bargaining shop where states meet up to negotiate. Within the EU, sovereignty is pooled, which means the EU has extensive powers in some areas, such as trade, but with quite restricted powers in others, such as security and defense policy. Moreover, the member states continue to be international actors next to the European Union on the international stage. And we must also not forget that the EU has changed a lot over time if we think back to the coal and steel community of the 1950s and compare that to the EU we have today after the Lisbon Treaty. Let us look more specifically at how the EU is appraised by these three theories respectively. As you can imagine, for realists, it is hard to fit the EU into their frame of mind because it is not a state, and especially because it has no army to defend itself and to fend for its own survival. It is also more generally a limited role in high politics, classical foreign policy, security policy, diplomacy. And for realists, it is important that the EU may be perceived as failing to respond quickly to international crises or to act at all. So for them, the EU is not a full power or actor in its own right, but rather, as Adrian Hyde Price has put it, a repository of the second-order normative and ethical concerns of its member states. So at the end of the day, it is again the member states which are the main actors. How does the EU fit in liberal scholarship on IR? If we recall that for liberal scholars there is a clear link between domestic politics and foreign policy, the EU itself can already be seen as an expression of democratic peace. Because the member states are democracies, they do not go to war with each other, and therefore the EU is a zone of peace in the world. From an economic perspective, the EU and its internal market can be seen as an expression of growing interdependence, of globalization in the world, but then also as part of a wider phenomenon in international relations. An important subcurrent within liberal scholarship is liberal intergovernmentalism, spearheaded by, for instance, Andrew Moravcsik. For liberal intergovernmentalists, they look more closely into these different levels of governance and how they interact with each other. Liberal intergovernmentalism helps to explain how national governments enhance their power domestically vis-à-vis other constitutional branches by cooperating within the EU. And this then also translates into EU foreign policy. So for liberal scholars, it is not so much about whether the EU is a power in its own right. For them it is rather an additional governance layer in politics and bargaining processes situated between the national level and the international level. What does the EU finally represent for constructivists as an international actor? Here the EU is also a strange animal, but rather in the sense of being an exceptional foreign policy actor, different from others. This is something that was early on noted already by François Duchesne in the 1970s, as he described the EU as a civilian power, so its power was different from that of traditional actors such as states. A proper constructivist approach then came later in the early 2000s with Ian Manners' concept of normative power, so really that foreign policy is driven by and based on norms rather than the national interest. So for Ian Manners, the most important factor in shaping the international role of the EU is not what it does or what it says, but what it is, as he put it back in 2002. Thus it is based on certain norms, which then create a power of attraction in its foreign relations. A further concept to describe the EU, which was elaborated upon later, mostly by Lisbeth Aggestam, is that of ethical power Europe. So while she also agrees that foreign policy can be based on norms and driven by values, it also requires proactive engagement, which is then guided by these global norms. So there's not only the passive power of attraction, but for both it is ideas that matter and which drive foreign policy. Each of these theories and their main proponents will look to certain cases in point to bolster their theoretical framework and which serve as examples of how they can explain what is happening internationally. So for realist scholars, it would, for instance, be the failure to act decisively in certain crises, such as the Bosnian Civil War back in the 90s, or more recently in Libya or Syria. Realist scholars would use this as examples that the EU is no global power at all at the end of the day. For liberal scholars, on the other hand, negotiation processes, bargaining processes are extremely important. For instance, free trade negotiations, such as those between the US and the EU. Here you can look at how interest groups at the domestic level influence these policies and help explain what's going on in EU trade policy. Finally, for constructivists, certain campaigns the EU has led, for instance in support of the International Criminal Court or against the death penalty around the world, serve as examples of EU foreign policy being guided by values and norms rather than its own interests. So what should we take away from this brief introductory video on IR theory and EU external action? Well, first of all, let us not forget throughout this course that every assessment of international action is based on certain premises. IR theory helps us to be aware of those premises, put them into a more coherent explanatory framework, and also be quite critical of other assessments and the premises that they are based on. This applies also and especially to the EU, given that it is rather an unusual international actor, and that, as we have seen, every theory may appraise its action or indeed its very actorness quite differently. And lastly, we mustn't forget that the European Union as an international actor is also a moving target, that it has changed a lot over time. If we think back to the coal and steel community of the early 1950s and what we have now after the Lisbon Treaty, and that also it is prone to evolve further in the future and will therefore require more attention also from a theoretical point of view.